This is a slideshow slash walkthrough on an inspector calls how to really get a higher grade with some proven easy tips. This is not a video for last minute cramming as much as I'd like it to be. It will walk you through some ideas about responsibility and some ideas overall about the play. So let's get started. An Inspector Calls, as you will know, is a play that was first performed in 1945 in Moscow. It then premiered in London. It had its debut, you could say, its first time playing in London in 1946. Okay, the marking criteria. Okay, so the AQA marking criteria talks about methods. And this basically means that you understand the techniques by which Priestley, whether he intends them or not, what does this technique by Priestley, whether intended or not, represent? So what is it doing? So there's all sorts of things going on. So structurally, you can talk about all of the things that, how the play hangs together from beginning to end, and why do certain events happen where they do. So why does Mr. Burling pick up the phone at the end of the play and hear that a girl has actually just died, and the police, the quote-unquote real police, are on their way over for an interrogation? This means that the inspector's visit has been just but a mere dress rehearsal, you could say, quote-unquote dress rehearsal for their confessions, their kind of performances of guilt from Sheila and Eric, and a way in perhaps for Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling to maybe change, although they're not going to, are they? Because they haven't changed from the beginning of the play, their attitudes to the ends of them. They don't feel any responsibility for Eva Smith / Daisy. Okay, so also other things to do with methods are, what do the characters represent? What is their social position? What do they stand to lose by admitting their guilt? What are they able to do or not do based on their relative standing in society is another way of putting that. So what kind of resources do they have to hand? Do they have money, land, assets? Burling has much of that. He has a factory, he has money, he has a public title. He was Lord Mayor of Bromley, this imagined northern industrial town which sounds a lot like Priestley's Bradford and maybe London's Bromley and many other places as well in England. So how far and in what ways do they show Priestley's ideas? Do the characters embody Priestley's ideas? So the inspector is in many ways a proxy, a stand-in for Priestley's preferred sense of community, that is a progressive, or you could say socialist, model of society. So you could say, how do the characters represent the 7 deadly sins? So you could say Mr. Priestley embodies greed, perhaps. Mrs. Burling, pride. She has this charity, but doesn't actually dispense any charity to a woman that is pregnant and destitute with nowhere to go, because she Eva / Daisy wrote on her application that her name was Mrs. Burling as a sort of dark joke, I suppose. But it's not inaccurate, because Eric will find out in the next part of the later on that Eric actually did impregnate her when drunk. So Eric could also represent the sin of gluttony, or kind of infidelity, or kind of a few different things actually with Eric. So how do they represent the class system and its hypocrisies? So if you're not familiar with that, get familiar with that. Get your teachers to talk about sociological theories, to get them to talk about Max Weber and Karl Marx, both two Germans of which have a lot to say about class, very differently. One with a revolutionary kind of horizon for how the working class is an agent of change and can end this system of exploitation, and Max Weber, who was more of a liberal, who basically just had a look at the class system and basically said, yes, there's these different occupations and there's different things going on there. So how does the inspector perhaps represent the supernatural or not? So think about language here. His name is Inspector Ghoul. It's a homophone on the actual ghoulishness that he maybe represents or not, because as we know, he's eerily prescient, eerily foreseeing about the two wars, the fire, the blood, and the anguish, as he calls it, to come. Okay? Alright, let's move on. So to get a high kind of 7 to 9 grade, we need to give alternative views about character. We need to write a lot about a little. So the little is writing focusing in on one character, perhaps if we're writing about one character. So we need to have two discrete, so two isolated, and sometimes conflicting points of view. So you'll see a bit later that having two or more points of view or qualified explanations, so saying yes, but also what about this? However, we can also see that Eric is not completely irredeemable, because he does provide Eva/Daisy with money at great personal expense to himself, because it comes from his dad's factory, his father's factory. Okay? So we could look at Eric as an alcoholic, a racist, and a thief. So he perhaps not I don't know about a racist, but he does say things that are dubious. So look at the language he uses to justify his behaviour to himself and to the inspector as well. I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. I threatened to cause a row. Look how he doesn't actually talk about what he does. I threatened to cause a row. Well, what does that look like? Does that mean you shouted a bit? Does he actually grab a hold of her? Or was it more kind of jokey? Was it kind of... we don't exactly know. In a court of law, we need more witnesses. Who was in the pub at the time, who can verify what he was like in that drunken state. Okay, there is the possibility that he's actually been quite violent, and he's been quite coercive, and we have to infer, we have to gap fill what his behaviour was actually like with Eva/Daisy. Was it coercive? Was it violent? Does it imply rape, or is it slightly something a bit more less violent, slightly more innocent, but not really? The language he uses to describe himself when drunk, chap, and not kind of yob, for example, is quite telling. It doesn't really admit to himself that he might be capable of violence. He's still a gentleman when drunk. He's still a chap. So that's one possibility, an upper class chap. That's one possibility there. So to get at least a B, or at least a 6 or a 7, we'd have to give the alternative view of Eric, the side that says that he's actually not a liar, a racist, and a thief. He's who is a drunkard as well. He's actually maybe underloved or unloved. He's undervalued at his father's business. He's just given this not very this position in his father's factory, where he's not given much responsibility, but he's also repentant about, if you're writing a question about responsibility, you could say that he is repentant. He regrets what he's done. In other words, at the end, he shouts at his parents and he says, "And I said the girl's dead, and we all helped to kill her, and that's what matters." Okay, so Eric clearly undergoes a shift. It doesn't matter what you argue as the correct interpretation, as long as you argue for the differences in Eric's statements convincingly. As long as you say, if you consider both Erics, the Erics we'd like to see, one Eric which we wouldn't really like to see, and the other Eric which we might want to actually quite see, and Priestley would like to see, because he will, in many ways, if he continues this, he might actually be different from his father eventually. When in 1945, when the play is set, he will be his father's age. This play is set in 1912. Don't forget. So there is that. Okay. So if you argue for both, you'll get at least a B. But you have to do it with some kind of with proper sentences and a few other things as well, which we'll get to. Okay. So that's one of the adaptations there. An alternative viewpoints for Sheila. At the beginning, throughout the middle, she appears vain, jealous, vengeful. She's concerned with status and wealth. And this is what she says to Gerald: "I knew you were lying, but those months last year when you hardly came near me." So she seems kind of She's clearly astute, but she's suspicious. She's showing off her ring at the beginning. She's talking about the engagement at least, and at the end of the play, however, there's a kind of shift in her statement. Quite soon after she's confronted with the fact that she helped push out Eva from the job that she had at the department store Millwards by threatening to boycott the store with her family, because her family have a lot of money and they spend a lot in the store. So that's basically what was going on there, if you didn't quite catch that. So she's threatening to boycott the store if Eva isn't fired for kind of smirking at her when she was trying on her dress. But after she finds out, she's quickly repentant as well. And she says, "Oh, so we're really responsible," to the inspector. You'll find that in Act 1. So from the beginning but overall, from beginning to end, you can see in these two statements here. At the end, she says, "I remember how he looked and how he made me feel fire, blood, and anguish." So the inspector's visit really did leave an impression on her as well. And you could argue how far this later statement cancels out or modifies, changes Sheila for the better, the earlier Sheila. So how far, you have to argue to what extent Sheila has changed, perhaps, as a question. You could suggest she is repentant, eager to learn, and possibly able to change the future direction of the Burling family. Okay, right, good. So Gerald, he happens to be a friend of mine, and let me have the keys to a nice set of rooms. So he's someone who appears. That's him talking about what he did for Eva/Daisy. So that might appear, while it might appear in this quote, that he has, of his own generosity, offered to provide a set of rooms from his friend. It also signals that he's willing to put Eva somewhere and have her as he would like to, usually for his own sexual gratification. So again, he has her as his mistress. So there's an element of Gerald which is both generous but also manipulative. So he's young and he's loving, but the inspector says, "At least you cared about Eva." Although Gerald says he didn't know Eva, there should be a no there, you could argue he loved her. Gerald treated Eva as though he loved her. We don't really know if he did, or if he was just using her as something for his a quick thrill. In other words, not to put it too crudely, and don't put he was using her as a quick thrill in your essays. But we can see these two points of view, both generous but also manipulative. Did he love her, or was he really just using her for sex? That's something you have to hold in each of your hands, in your essays, and you have to come to a conclusion. You have to come down on one side either way in your essay. It's better that you do, as long as you present alternative viewpoints. Okay, Priestley's purpose, as we talked about very briefly, passingly, the post-war period, the Labour government of Attlee was whisked to power on a wave of progressive sentiment of working people who had experienced war and hardship and rationing, the Blitz, but also people that were returning from fighting, and they wanted, partly because of what was happening in the Soviet Union as well, with things that were being provided to the working class there, there was a lot of pressure on things to be different when the war had finished. And when the war did finish in 1945, there was the birth of a welfare state. Many things like the NHS and things that had been previously quite out of reach for the working class, for the working poor, suddenly became in reach. So like healthcare and other benefits. Of course, there were, it wasn't a complete transformation, and you could argue that the welfare state had limitations, but that's not what we're going to do in this video. Right, so And in the middle of this, in the sort of in the nucleus of this new welfare state, there was a Priestley's play, which was performed in 1946 in London. Priestley most likely approved on the whole with Attlee's Labour government, and the play is looking back to an earlier time when things weren't when Priestley isn't looking forward with optimism to what could be, but the inspector is looking forward actually to the decades to come from 1912, the 20s and the 30s, of fascism, the world wars, the Holocaust, everything that will happen, etc., etc., in Europe, but also elsewhere as well. So in many ways, the post-war welfare state is in many ways socialistic, but it also preserves the capitalist mechanism way of having private businesses and having profit. So those things don't go away in 1946. There shouldn't be an apostrophe here, by the way. So the Burlings will still exist in 1946, but they will be reined in. Their power will be reined in to be less exploitative, and perhaps their children, Eric and Sheila, won't be their father or their mother. They'll be new people in this welfare state. They'll take up new jobs and they'll dedicate themselves to the public good. That's Priestley's purpose, in other words. Okay. So you could argue that the play is less about the necessity, the need for socialism. It shows Priestley's underlying Christian morality. So if you've never heard about socialism, you can know it by what it's close to, and that's a Christian morality, that you do unto your neighbour as you would like to be done to you. You make sure that everyone is clothed and fed, and basically that people take care of each other, and that ideally there's no war, and the language which really supports this Christian morality basically just means the way we the judgments we make about other people and how we treat other people, in other words, and how we treat other people. So the inspector's final pronouncement, which kind of sounds like which sounds more Christian than it does socialist, is that he talks about we live as one body, as though we were a church congregation, as one community. The language of the church is not quite the vocabulary of socialists, although they are quite Christianity and socialism can overlap massively in their morality. Okay, but one doesn't really believe in God historically, and the other does actually believe in God. It's a bit more. You can go deeper and deeper with these things, but I'm going to move to the next slide. Okay, so there's lots of things going on in structurally to support Priestley's purpose. So there's the surprises at the end, there's the phone call at the end, there's the dramatic irony. So you'll remember that Eva/Daisy calls herself Mrs. Burling in her charity application, but that would be accurate if Eric could marry her, but he can't because she's a lower class woman. So if you did get a woman pregnant and you were an upper class man and you'd impregnated someone else who was perhaps a woman of the same class, historically in the England of old, you'd marry her quickly, lest your child be called a bastard. So that's how that works, and it's dramatic irony because as we find out that Eric actually did impregnate Eva. She was pregnant with his child when she goes to see Mrs. Burling's Bromley Women's Association, Mrs. Burling's charity. So coup de theatre is a dramatically sudden action or turn of events, especially in a play. So think about the ending. It's revealed that the inspector, there's doubt laid on whether the inspector is actually a real inspector when Mr. Burling picks up the phone call. Okay. So there's a use of photographs. Does the inspector show them the same photograph, or as when he produces it from his coat pocket, is it a completely different woman is there a singular identity? Is there a singular woman, or is it two or more women? So we'll return to this, I say next week, but that's we won't return to this next week because this is not for another time. But does doubt ultimately undermine the inspector's authority? Question mark there. Okay, so Gerald puts forward the hypothesis, the idea to be tested, that there is no single stable identity of Daisy/Eva. Instead, they've all been interacting, however wrongly, with possibly separate women. So think about the challenges to the inspector. That's something that's not often taught at GCSE or given enough room, I think, to breathe as an idea, but it is actually quite a valid one. Ultimately, you could say though that might be true. Gerald's idea might be true, but it doesn't mean that the characters' interactions with these women are they're no less exploitative or wrong in a way. So you could say that yes, Gerald might be true, that they might be being played by this inspector, but nevertheless they have acted in terrible ways that they would be ashamed of. Okay, so that's a BBC recent adaptation. Right, so advice from the examiner now. Let's breeze forward. Characters are not necessarily real people. So what does this mean? What is the consequences? They are not factually real. They are constructed. So remember that. The purpose of constructs is to put forward ideas in a way, and especially so for this play. So Sheila at first is constructed around the ideas of vanity and selfishness, but does she move beyond this? And we have argued, yes, that she does. There's the first glimmers that she will continue with the ideas that she's learned on this night from the inspector. She's been confronted with a mirror image of herself from the inspector, like she was trying on the dress in the mirror. She's been confronted with this images of herself, and she doesn't like it. However, Arthur Burling, he will continue protecting his money and his profits and his status, and he will just basically say, she left my factory 2 years ago. I'm not responsible for what happened to her in that time between when I fired her and when she died. So that's his argument, if you remember Act 1. Okay? The play is a performance, don't forget. So drama allows you to see these archetypal behaviors, these types. So think of the 7 deadly sins. They are they're not pure archetypes of greed and selfishness. They're complicated people. At least Sheila and Eric are not just pure vanity or greed, but perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Burling are more like purer archetypes. They're more motivated by greed or pride. Proud of your achievements. That's what pride is. Okay, so think about how Priestley organizes the drama to make you see these behaviors more starkly, in more contrast, more dramatically. That's important not to lose sight of. So think about the effect on the audience, and what kind of audience would have first seen this in London, but also in Moscow. In Moscow, it might have been an audience of working people who would have agreed with a lot of the ideas, and they would have hated someone like Mr. Burling because they were ostensibly, on the surface, that is, ostensibly means they were a country that had gotten rid of people like Mr. Burling. They've gotten completely rid of them. I'm not in a position to say in this video how they did that, because that's a long history lesson. But remember the effect on the audience. The audience is not a single united group. They're not a bunch of lefties who just hate the Burlings. They would have been people that would have been also middle class, middle income or middle class. So they would have been not necessarily socialist, but maybe tending or sympathetic towards these ideas. So they might not necessarily have been Christian as well. So think about that. Although in 1945 more people would have been Christian, it doesn't necessarily hold in all cases at all times. So think about the effect on the audience, but think about how information is also revealed to the audience. So things like dramatic irony as well. So we don't, in the position of someone watching it for the first time, things are gradually dripped out to us about what characters have done. So think about how we don't know, just as the characters don't know, just as Eric doesn't know what the inspector will have on him. Okay. So think about stage directions at the beginning, how Arthur Burling is seated at the head of the table as the patriarch, and his wife at the other. It's quite cold. They're not together. And think about how characters are described. So Eric is half shy, half confident. And what these relative positions on the table also, and the descriptions as well about them, what it tells us about the status of women relative to men. So she's removed from her husband, Mrs. Burling. It tells us who has control in the family. And it tells you there's division in this marriage. Okay, so the ending, as they stare guiltily and dumbfounded, the curtain falls. They share a sense of guilt. They stare guilty and dumbfounded. So they're guilty and confused, dumbfounded, they don't know what's hit them, and then the play ends. Right. Okay. So to choose the best question is the one that you feel most confident, most adept in handling, and the one that you are ready to analyze in more than one way with the alternative viewpoint. So the one you feel most prepared for, you have the most quotes on, you have a sheet of quotes on Eric, and you decide that yes, there's a quote where you can actually talk about Eric, pick a question which will address social ideas, the context, and Priestley, his purpose, and focus on two characters max. So we don't want to just talk about just Eric and Sheila, the younger generation, and the reactions or the resistance to how they might change. So to get an A or an A star to 8 or a 9, remember, analyze the writer's purpose and explore multiple interpretations. So that's all. Talk about Priestley and social ideas. This isn't at least a B. So don't just talk about Priestley and social ideas alone. You have to talk about language, structure and form, but talk about how it relates to what Priestley is doing. So we can see, for example, from this quote we can see, but on the other hand, we might suggest that. Okay. So if we're talking about dramatic irony as an example, we might say Priestley uses dramatic irony as a key effect to place the audience in a position of greater knowing against those assembled for the Burling celebration. So irony is basically a discrepancy between what is presented and what is known. So the audience are presented they're in a position of greater knowing, or not great knowing, but greater than the Burlings, what the Burlings are about to know. It can be defined as a feature of speeches or a situation of drama which is understood by the audience but not grasped by the characters in the play. The dramatic irony in the ending is evident in Burling's comments on his children at the end of the play when he mocks them. He mocks the younger generation who think they know it all. Priestley is possibly suggesting that Burling has learnt nothing yet about himself or the future to come. And it's ironic because the inspector is the only person who is vaguely prescient, forward-seeing, to foresee in 1912 the hint of fire and blood and anguish that will come in the next decades with the two world wars, with the rise of fascism, with the massive changes for Britain. Of course, this play is written with the benefit of hindsight because it is written at the end of this process in which the war's just finished and there's been kind of great atrocity and hardship for people in Europe, but also elsewhere as well. So the rise of Nazism, which in many ways it's not thought of this way, but it's sort of a rival empire as well. It wants to conquer land as well. It tries to conquer bits of Europe. Anyway, so at the end of the play, there's the telephone that immediately rings to relay the information that a girl has just died, and it kind of foresees that the Burlings will have to do this all over again. And perhaps Priestley is suggesting with the changes that they've undergone as more responsible people, perhaps, in the ways that they say, oh, so we're really responsible. So Sheila says, so we're really responsible, in Act 1. So Priestley is possibly suggesting that Sheila and Eric think they know more than they did, but their lesson is superficially learnt. The key question, I think, is will Sheila and Eric continue their shift with the powerless, the weak workers like Eva, or will they live their lives in wealth and security under the protection of guardians, so their parents or Sheila's fiancé, Gerald? That's the key point of Priestley's purpose. Will Sheila and Eric really change? Will they become more responsible? Or will they become like their parent, the protectors of titles and industry and their inheritances and their pride, basically? So the younger generation, and as much as the old, has not quite learned or acted upon the inspector's lesson, although they're heading in the right direction. All right, let's go. So let's remember the grade 9, the A star, or the A checklist is that we have an introduction explaining our key terms. So we understand what we mean by socialism. We understand what we mean by Christian morality. We understand that we have to write quotes which have multiple interpretations, and we switch this around. When we want to change to the other side, we put a full stop, and we have connectives, or we don't have to finish our sentence, but we could also have connectives. Sorry, I'm rushing, I'm going. But we can have, on the other hand, we could have however, we could have yet at the same time, and so on and so on. So there are many ways we can do it. So we can have connectives, we can have a full stop and have yet at the same time, and so on. Close analysis involves being clear and analytical, writing a lot about a little, about the question and analysing, knowing the writer's purpose and explaining the writer, their times, and having a closing statement overall, deciding how far and in what ways we come down on the question. So do we think, overall I think that, as I've said here, the younger Burlings show signs of promise in ways that Priestley would consider favourable to his own politics. That is a politics that was being born out at the moment the play was first performed. A politics of the welfare state and of modest socialism. So not quite full socialism like Soviet Union. But we can't get into that. Or you could say, overall, I think that Sheila and Eric are edging towards a more Christian morality in the way that they consider themselves more responsible. To finish off with what a high grade answer might look like, we have a paragraph here on the dramatic irony that I've just been talking about, and also Sheila and Eric's place in the ending and what their future might be as sketched out. Okay, let's read it. The second death, the second phone call that Mr. Burling picks up, carries with it Priestley's political point that the lessons of World War I represented by the death of Eva, so perhaps they are represented by the death of Eva or not. Doesn't have to be the case that death of Eva does represent that. Were not learnt. Okay, so the second death carries with it Priestley's political point that the lessons of World War I represented by the death of Eva were not learnt. The Burlings now face, in the final word of the play, questions. Priestley's question in 1945 is how the ruling classes allowed World War II to ever take place. In any case, perhaps this was a just war, a moral war against the spread of Nazism, which was thoroughly unpleasant, brought about in part, so qualifier there, by the unresolved failures of World War I. So it's not just the unresolved failures of World War I that led to World War II, in which millions of lives, ordinary people like Eva Smith, lost lives again. So they're the ones that are ultimately paid, not the Burlings. Eric and Sheila therefore represent a younger generation who can take the lessons of the night in the inspector's questioning with them to live up to their social responsibility. So to prevent war, to make sure that the working class, not just in Britain but elsewhere, internationally, might be not lose their lives. Priestley's play not only reflects the mood of the nation, but may seem to directly question whether such change can be long-lasting or even permanent. So will these things continue to happen as long as we have people like the Burlings, the powerful? The country had got rid of Winston Churchill's conservative government that had taken them to war, replacing them with the socialist Labour government. It's not then Sheila and Eric who have learnt their lesson, but their children who will have to. So that's something to think about. These are lessons that we might have to continue carry on through generation to generation. And it's not just something that is confined to one single moment in 1945-46. Alright, so this has been a video, a long one, hopefully very helpful, and hopefully you'll have some feedback for me. So tell me what you liked, what you didn't like about this video, and I will see you soon.